What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Mark Twain was somehow even more interesting than you thought. Samuel Clemens, the real name of author Mark Twain, is one of the most well-loved writers of all time, certainly up there with the likes of Ernest Hemingway, William Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe, and Charles Dickens. But for most, the details of his most famous works, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, are more memorable than his biography. In truth, Mark Twain's life story was in many ways as dynamic as the adventures in his books. He traveled widely, underwent his share of tragedy, collaborated with Nikola Tesla, and was even said to be a dead-on-the-money psychic. Read on to find out more about the escapades of one of American literature's most brilliant storytellers and satirists. He wrote a pornographic Elizabethan story. Most don't realize that Twain occasionally penned smut, but pen it he did, though smut, by his standards, was more of a witty exercise in satire than a lurid plunge into the unsavory. At the time, 1601, named for the year of its setting, was the most famous piece of literary pornography around, which is probably why Twain published it anonymously in 1880. Taken from the journals of one of Queen Elizabeth the First Ladies-in-Waiting, 1601 records the Queen's racy conversations with some of the leading authors of her day. The subjects include sex, flatulence, and a host of other body hilarities. He got his brother the job that killed him. In 1857, when he was in his early 20s, Twain got a job as an apprentice steamboat pilot. He worked on a vessel called the Pennsylvania, situated on the Mississippi River, and eventually got his younger brother, Henry, a job aboard the same ship. Not long afterwards, however, Henry, who was only 19, was tragically killed when a boiler explosion rocked the ship. Twain's devastation was made all the more acute by the fact that he'd had a premonition of the tragedy. He had a dream the day before the Pennsylvania set out on its fateful journey that he had seen Henry as a corpse, laid out in a metal casket, dressed in one of his older brother's suits, with a huge bouquet of white roses on his chest and a single red rose at the center. And so, horribly it came to pass. On the day of Henry's viewing, Twain found his brother, lying in the open coffin dressed in a suit of his older brother's own clothing. He immediately remembered his dream. Just then, an elderly lady brought a bouquet of white roses with one red rose in the center. She placed it on Henry's chest. He was a patented inventor and he worked with Tesla. Most people don't associate Twain with the worlds of either science or invention, but in fact, 3 of his inventions were patented: a history trivia game, a variation on garment fasteners, aka suspenders, and a self-pasting scrapbook, which was probably a book with some kind of built-in adhesive, but sounds rather like a collection of memorabilia with a consciousness of its own. Twain was also a friend of inventor Nikola Tesla's, and he once volunteered to demonstrate the use of the human body as a conductor of electricity. Obviously in a way that didn't end up entailing electrocution. Partially as a result of his digestive issues, he also agreed to volunteer as a guinea pig for Tesla's oscillator, described as a kind of vibrating platform. Legend has it that the invention worked. Twain was known for having digestive problems, so Tesla, who knew Twain through their gentlemen's club, invited him over. He instructed Twain to stand on the platform while he flipped on the oscillator. After about 90 seconds, Twain jumped off the platform and ran for the facilities. He was said to have been psychic, and there's convincing evidence to prove it. In addition to his prophetic dream about his brother's death and his famous prediction about his own death, Mark Twain was said to have experienced other psychic incidents. According to his mother, he predicted his 9-year-old sister's death when he was 4. There were also occasions involving friends, including one that was recounted in an 1891 article on mental telegraphy in Harper's. In it, Twain recalls a time when a friend of his visited Washington, D.C. Although he didn't coordinate with said individual beforehand, he was browsing in a shop when suddenly the man came back into his mind, and he knew with startling specificity that if he left the shop, turned left and walked 10 feet, his friend would be standing there. And he was right. He served in a Confederate militia and called himself politically ignorant afterward. Though Twain, briefly, continued his career as a riverboat captain, Even after his brother Henry's death, it ended with the onset of the Civil War in 1861, when riverboat traffic ground to a halt. Twain joined a Confederate militia, the Marion Rangers, but he quit after only 2 weeks. He showed up, riding a mule and carrying a squirrel rifle and an umbrella, according to a fellow recruit. Legend has it that the shortness of Twain's stint in the Rangers was partially the result of the authors being intimidated by none other than Ulysses S. Grant himself. However, Twain was also a liberal who opposed slavery, and he later chalked up his temporary participation in the cause to political ignorance. His birth and death dates coincided with Halley's Comet. Twain's relationship with Halley's Comet is unique, and it has a significant impact on the author's reputation as a psychic. Though Twain was born 2 weeks after the comet's appearance in 1835, he also predicted that he would die the day after its return in 1910. And he did. As he stated in 1909, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. I anticipate bringing it with me when it returns the following year. It will be the greatest disappointment of my life if I don't go out with Halley's Comet. The Almighty has said, no doubt. Now here are these 2 unaccountable freaks. They came in together, they must go out together." Almost all of his siblings died at a young age. Infant and child mortality was common in Twain's era. The author had a total of 7 brothers and sisters, but only half of the children survived. His brother Henry, at least until he was killed in a riverboat accident at 19. His brother Orion, who lived to be 72, and his sister Pamela, who lived to be almost 90. Pleasant, his other brother, only lived for a year, and Margaret, his older sister, died of bilious fever when she was 9 years old. He almost drowned multiple times as a child. According to his autobiography, Twain's boyhood was marked by a series of near-catastrophic accidents involving water, which he loved but didn't know how to swim in. He claimed to have almost drowned a total of at least 9 times, including once in Bear Creek and 6 times in the Mississippi. He recalls being fished out of the water on at least one of these occasions by a slave woman, and he was rescued by a young apprentice on another. He left school after the 5th grade. Many continue to be surprised by the fact that Twain, who would go on to become one of the most accomplished figures in American letters, left school after the 5th grade. Though no learned person ought to be taken aback, as the world is filled with famous autodidacts, from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe to Walt Whitman to Frida Kahlo to Frank Lloyd Wright. Twain read voraciously all through his youth, and at 18, he left for New York and Philadelphia to pursue a career as a newspaperman. A highly successful venture that was never hindered by his lack of formal education. The pen name Mark Twain has a specific meaning. Though Clemens wrote under many pen names, including Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass, Sergeant Fathom, and W. Epaminondas Adrastus Blab, before settling on Mark Twain, his final moniker had a very special and very nautical meaning. Mark Twain was an expression used by Mississippi boatmen. It meant the second mark on the line that measured depth signified 2 fathoms, or 12 feet, safe depth for the steamboat. His daughter fell into the tub and drowned, uncannily and tragically. Given her father's many brushes with death by drowning, Twain's youngest daughter Jean did, in fact, drown in her bathtub at the young age of 25, after suffering a seizure brought on by epilepsy. Twain was deeply affected by her untimely death. In a piece published in the New York Times on April 21, 1910, the author remarked that her tragic death had much to hurry his end. When we think of iconic American writers, Mark Twain, born Samuel Langhorne Clemens in 1835, is invariably near the top of the list, sharing literary immortality with the likes of Ernest Hemingway, Edgar Allan Poe, William Faulkner, and Walt Whitman. Yet despite being most famous for creating the timeless characters Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, his life was just as gripping, outrageous, and darkly humorous as anything he wrote, maybe even more so, which makes it all the more remarkable that many readers know more about the boyish misadventures in his novels than about the endlessly fascinating man behind them. Twain was not only a novelist but a journalist, inventor, humorist, investor, failed entrepreneur, world traveler, devoted father, melancholy philosopher, and unintentional psychic who predicted both his own death and his brother's in startling detail. Stories so odd and vivid they could almost pass for folklore, starting with the astonishing and macabre tale of how he got his younger brother Henry a job aboard a Mississippi steamboat called the Pennsylvania in 1857, only to have that very ship suffer a catastrophic boiler explosion that left Henry mortally wounded, a tragedy made even more haunting by Twain's claim that he had dreamt the entire scene the night before. The coffin, the clothing, the white flowers with one red bloom at the center, and then saw it play out exactly as envisioned, down to the smallest detail, when his brother's body was laid out for the funeral. And though Twain carried the guilt of this event for the rest of his life, it was far from the only eerie or shocking story in his personal history, because Twain, always restless, always curious, had a flair for inserting himself into strange and colorful episodes, such as the time he wrote 1601, a smutty Elizabethan satire featuring Queen Elizabeth I and her courtiers engaging in uproariously bawdy talk about flatulence and fornication, which, while tame by today's standards, was considered outrageously indecent in 1880 and was thus published anonymously, yet demonstrates that Twain was no prude, but rather a man of fearless intellect and irreverent wit who enjoyed shocking the genteel sensibilities of his Victorian audience, much like he did when he later teamed up with the legendary inventor Nikola Tesla, becoming not just friends but experiment participants, visiting Tesla's lab, where he stood on an oscillating platform that Tesla believed could help digestion. Twain, long afflicted by stomach troubles, tried it, laughed, and after about 90 seconds reportedly sprinted off to the bathroom with impressive urgency, suggesting that the prototype worked a little too well. A tale that, whether apocryphal or not, captures the spirit of a man who threw himself into every era's new technology, even holding patents for 3 inventions himself, including a trivia game, a type of suspenders, and a revolutionary self-pasting scrapbook that actually sold well, adding to the surprising list of things Twain did that had nothing to do with fiction writing, like joining a Confederate militia at the start of the Civil War despite later becoming a fierce critic of slavery and injustice, though his stint with the Marion Rangers lasted only 2 weeks, possibly cut short by his distaste for combat or, as some legends suggest, an intimidating encounter with Ulysses S. Grant himself. And later Twain explained the episode by admitting he had been politically ignorant at the time, which tracks with his evolution from naive young man into a sharp-tongued satirist who exposed the hypocrisies of Gilded Age America. Yet even that couldn't save him from crushing personal losses, like the tragic death of his daughter Jean, who drowned in a bathtub following an epileptic seizure. A cruel irony given that Twain himself had nearly drowned multiple times as a child, including 6 times in the Mississippi and once in Bear Creek, a fact he recalled in his autobiography with that signature blend of deadpan humor and shocking nonchalance, noting how a slave woman once hauled him from the river, and how he miraculously survived despite having no swimming skills. And still, the most chilling coincidence of all was that Twain was born just after Halley's Comet passed Earth in 1835, and predicted that he would die upon its return in 1910. Which he did, making his departure every bit as theatrical as his life had been, saying a year before his death, "I came in with Halley's Comet, and I expect to go out with it." A quote so eerily accurate it further cemented his status as a man seemingly guided by forces beyond comprehension, especially since his brushes with clairvoyance weren't limited to Halley's Comet or his brother's death. His mother claimed he once predicted the death of a sibling when he was only 4 years old, and Twain himself wrote about moments of so-called mental telegraphy, including one episode in which he was struck by an intense certainty that a friend in Washington, D.C. was waiting on a nearby street corner, walked out, turned left, and found him exactly there, confirming Twain's lifelong belief in something deeper, stranger, and harder to explain beneath the surface of human experience, though the skeptics in him and his readers would no doubt roll their eyes at the notion, as Twain often did, himself treating such oddities with a blend of bemusement and curiosity that typified his writing voice, which despite his lack of formal education, he left school after the 5th grade, became one of the most distinctive in American literature, rich with dialect, satire, and realism, shaped more by experience and relentless reading than by any institution, as he spent his young adulthood bouncing from city to city, working as a typesetter, reporter, and humorist long before he published the Innocents Abroad or Roughing It, And long before he became the globe-trotting celebrity who was welcomed by kings and commoners alike on his world lecture tours, where he earned vast sums of money but also lost them just as quickly through poor investments, most notably in a failed typesetting machine that bankrupted him and forced him back on tour to repay his debts, which he did, honorably and entirely, even turning down offers to clear them through bankruptcy, because despite his wit, Twain took personal responsibility seriously, especially when it came to the well-being of his family, even though fate continued to deal him blow after blow. Not only did he lose Henry in the steamboat tragedy and Jean in her bathtub, but his beloved daughter Susie died young from meningitis, and his wife Olivia passed after years of illness, leaving Twain in his later years a man of remarkable intellect and humor weighed down by deep sorrow and isolation. Yet even through all of this he continued to write and speak, never shying away from attacking the injustices he saw in the world: imperialism, religious hypocrisy, slavery, and racial prejudice, with a razor-sharp tongue and a satirical pen, which was all the more impressive considering that in his youth he had participated in the very system he came to condemn, including briefly supporting the Confederacy. And that evolution from ignorance to advocacy marks one of the most important arcs in his life and work, mirrored in the journey of Huck Finn himself, who must unlearn the values of a racist society to follow his conscience, a moral awakening that reflects Twain's own, and perhaps no detail better symbolizes Twain's layered legacy than the pen name Mark Twain, a term borrowed from riverboat jargon meaning 2 fathoms deep, a safe depth for navigation, which he adopted not just as a nod to his days on the Mississippi, but also, perhaps, as a subtle metaphor for his writing itself, deceptively smooth on the surface but running deep with social commentary and psychological complexity beneath. And though Twain experimented with many other pseudonyms early on, like Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass and Sergeant Fathom, it was Mark Twain that stuck, becoming inseparable from the image of the white-suited, cigar-smoking, sarcastic observer of American folly, who poked fun at everything from politics to religion to human nature itself, often making enemies but always making readers laugh and think. And despite the recognition he received in his own lifetime, Twain's later years were increasingly marked by loneliness and grief, as he outlived most of his family and friends, and in the final months of his life after the death of Jean, it was said he never fully recovered, dying quietly in 1910 with the return of Halley's Comet, as he had predicted, closing the book on a life that was anything but quiet, a life that, for all its contradictions and eccentricities, encapsulates the boundless curiosity, humor, sadness, and brilliance of a man who lived far beyond the words he wrote and became one of the greatest, most unusual, and most human figures in literary history. She edited for Cosmopolitan magazine when she wasn't setting world records. Photo. NASA on the Commons Wikimedia Commons public domain. Amelia Earhart was one of those annoying superwomen who managed to set world records from her airplane while simultaneously being impossibly stylish and effortlessly cool on the ground. She was the kind of woman who set impossible standards for other women. In fact, her signature gender-bending look of closely cropped hair, homemade duds, and a tough leather bomber jacket earned her a place as an editor at Cosmopolitan magazine. Always pushing the envelope, instead of writing columns that focused on her clothes, however, Earhart used her post to extol the virtues of air travel. She paid her success forward by counseling other women. After her transatlantic flight, Earhart spent some time in Illinois, counseling women enrolled at Purdue University and helping them choose their ideal career paths. She also was a member of the 99s, a group of female pilots that advanced the cause of women in aviation. Not content to glory in her successes alone, Earhart made it one of her missions to cultivate a sense of purpose, self, and worthiness in the young women around her. She wouldn't stop trying to fly around the world. In 1937, Earhart made her first attempt at flying around the world. She and her co-pilot, Fred Noonan, flew to Hawaii from Oakland, California, but stopped due to technical difficulties. However, Earhart didn't give up and tried again a few months later after her Lockheed Electra, which was sponsored by Purdue University, was fixed. This time they flew in the opposite direction, heading from Miami over Africa, India, and South Asia. They made it a total of 22,000 miles. But the remaining 7,000 miles had to be flown over a precarious expanse of Pacific Ocean, and they disappeared a mere 800 miles into this part of the flight plan. The fact that Earhart was never seen or heard from again sparked decades of speculation regarding her death. She might have survived as a Pacific Island castaway. Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, disappeared on their way to Howland Island in the Pacific Ocean, so it makes sense that the search for them took place there. However, the recent discovery of a woman's skeleton and a piece of what could be her airplane might finally be the clues that solve the mystery. These remains were found on Nikumaroro Island, an uninhabited part of Kiribati. If the bones and piece of metal turn out to belong to Earhart, they are proof that she survived for some time on the island, either alongside Noonan or on her own. On the remote island of Nikumaroro in the South Pacific, a number of bones were discovered in 1940. At the time they were examined by Dr. D.W. Hoodless, who concluded they were those of a man after conducting a number of experiments on them. However, in March of 2018, the University of Tennis